All right, we should be recording. So this is the pre-processing lecture. As you probably noticed with homework 2, you're now dealing with real data for the first time, and real data is often quite messy. I mentioned last week this is what I consider to be the second most important lecture, and there's a couple of reasons for that. One reason is that, for better or for worse, if you want to do machine learning with real data, about 10% of your time will be machine learning, and about 90% of your time will be pre-processing. And if you do a single step of the pre-processing wrong, the machine learning won't work and you'll have no idea why. So it's really, really important, and it's really time consuming, and it's really hard. The other reason I consider this lecture to be really important is no other machine learning course teaches this because it's very domain specific. So if you switch from satellite imagery to cell phone images, all the pre-processing looks different. If you switch from images to text, again, completely different pre-processing. So it's really hard to teach it in most machine learning courses, and it's also really, really important. So some quick administrative things. You should have homework 1 grades. Most people did fine. I just showed you the homework 2 solutions. If you're watching the recording and want to see the homework 2 solutions, just come to lecture next week. Homework 3 is due in a week, and I'll show you homework 4 today. The other thing, so I like to do these kind of early informal feedback surveys throughout the semester. So every 3 to 4 weeks, I'm going to send out a survey about the homework assignments and the lectures so far. Basically just tell me what's good, what's bad, what can I improve, and that will give me really good feedback for the rest of the course. So for example, my first semester, I had a student say, hey, you only upload the PDF of the lecture slides. Can you also upload the PowerPoint so that we can get the animations? And I said, yeah, sure. So now I do that. I had another student say, I actually like to take notes directly in the PowerPoint. Can you upload it before lecture instead of after lecture? And so I do that. The homework assignments being due every 2 weeks instead of every 1 week, that was another student suggestion. So I'm very open to changing the course to improve learning. You just have to convince me that this is something that's valuable for learning, and then I'm pretty open. Any other administrative questions before we get started? I'll send out this survey over the weekend, probably whenever I have time. And I'll show the results hopefully next lecture if enough people respond. Okay. So today we're going to talk about a bunch of pre-processing all the way from raw satellite images down to level 1 and level 2 products, and then all of the machine learning specific processing that we need to do to make our data ML ready. Okay. So the first thing I want to talk about is the data itself. We saw a little bit of this in the data sources lecture 2 weeks ago, but I want to talk about why we need to do pre-processing at all. So one of the things that you might have noticed is that there's actually 2 different kinds of images. There's raster images. These are things like JPEGs, GIFs, PNGs, but also GeoTIFFs that you've already seen before on homework 2. Basically, these are traditional images. There's also vector file formats. So if you've ever seen a logo for a company, it's always a vector file format. This is, instead of storing every pixel, we actually store the mathematical representation of the shape. So instead of storing squares, we're storing points and lines and polygons and things. It turns out that this right side, this is actually quite common in remote sensing and Earth observation. For example, if you are trying to label buildings, you probably have a raster image of the Earth, and you have a set of polygons for each building, and that's the correct answer. You could convert one to the other, and that might make sense, and we'll show how to do that today. But these are very different types of files that serve very different purposes. So with a vector file, it's great. You can zoom in forever and it still looks the same. You can't do that with a regular image. I can't take an image from a satellite and just say enhance, 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 and zoom in to read someone's newspaper. That's unfortunately not how it works, unless you have a really powerful low-flying drone or something. Whereas with vectors, because we're storing the mathematical shape, you can zoom forever and the shape doesn't change, especially if it's just like a square. No matter how close you zoom to the corner, it's still a square. It's not going to change. The other thing, and the thing that we're really going to be focusing a lot on today, is this library called GDAL. This is basically the single most important software library ever created for geospatial everything. Every single thing that you've ever used, QGIS, ArcGIS, Google Maps, anything that relates to geospatial anything, is using this somewhere behind the scenes. This is the core infrastructure of everything. It's a pretty old library. It's been around, I think, 20 or 30 years. But it's maintained by the Open Source Geospatial Foundation, which is just a consortium of people who want good open source software. There's actually two different parts of the library, and this is mostly for historical reasons. It's not really a good thing. So there used to be two libraries, one called GDAL and one called OGR. GDAL was Geographic Data Abstraction Library, and then OGR was this OpenGIS reference implementation. GDAL does all of the raster things, so all of the image manipulation stuff, whereas OGR does all of the vector files. But they're more or less doing the same thing. You're doing things like resampling, reprojection, clipping. So it's mostly the same operations, and there were these two different groups who were developing different software for this. Eventually, the OGR group, it kind of started to fall apart. It wasn't maintained as well. So they actually ended up merging it into the GDAL library. So you'll either see people refer to both things as GDAL, or you'll see them refer to GDAL and OGR as separate things. It doesn't really matter which you use as long as you know what I'm talking about. So that's the state of the ecosystem. GDAL has been around for forever. It's written mostly in C++. I think there's a little bit of Python and C in there. And for the longest time, that's all we really had. So you would run this tool usually from the command line or in some sort of C++ program. And it was not always easy to work with. So I think when I started doing remote sensing 12 years ago, there wasn't really a way to do this in Python. You would have to do it manually from the command line or in a bash script and then use Python after you're done. Or you could run it in a sub-process and scrape the results and write your own parser. Shortly after that, GDAL released its own Python bindings. So this is basically an auto-generated binding into the library where you can run the same commands from Python that you would normally run in C++ or run on the command line. And that was great, but the problem is they're kind of auto-generated. They look like C++. All of the function names and classes look like C++. Even some of the errors behave similar as well. So for instance, if you import osgeo.gdal and you run some kind of command, even if it fails, the Python script keeps going, which is not normally how Python works, right? Normally errors are fatal. But because it's calling out to C++, it's not an error in Python, it's an error in C++. That's not my problem. So these exist, they're very powerful, but they also require a little bit of knowledge and skill to get used to. There's a lot of quirks that make them more challenging. There's also not great documentation for them because they mostly assume you're going to read the C++ documentation and things are mostly the same in Python. So I very rarely use the OSGeo bindings. I typically use things like raster.io and Fiona and GeoPandas. And these are somewhat handcrafted bindings for GDAL. They're written in Python for Python people. They behave like Python. They're relatively simple and easy to use. They don't have all of the features that GDAL has because they're focusing on the most important ones, but they're much more fun to learn. They're much more natural to learn. So raster.io is the Python bindings for GDAL, and then Fiona and GeoPandas are both raster.io, both Python bindings for OGR. So there's one for raster, there's one for vector. Okay. The other thing that's really tricky with working with geospatial data is the number of file formats that we deal with. So I showed that slide earlier with raster and vector where there were like 3 common raster files and 1 common vector file. Unfortunately, in remote sensing, there's a lot more file types out there that are much more obscure and less commonly used. So for whatever reason, it kind of feels like everyone who builds their own satellite or builds their own data center wants their own file format to have slightly better compression or slightly better range or something. So there's unfortunately a lot of different file formats. Luckily for you, part of the reason that GDAL is so important and is such a strong core of the ecosystem is because GDAL can read basically every file format ever written for satellite imagery. So in the raster space, there's over 160 drivers for everything from GeoTIFFs, NetCDFs, HDF4 and 5, etc. In the vector space, there's another 80 drivers for things like shapefiles, GeoJSON, KML, etc. Not all of these file formats are as powerful as others. So for example, you could technically store all of your data in a CSV file. And that CSV file might not actually store the geospatial metadata. You would just add that as a comment later. Oh, all of my numbers are in latitude and longitude. And then you would have to say, oh, okay, that means this is the coordinate reference system. Whereas others like ERSI shapefile or GeoTIFF, you can actually store that geospatial metadata inside the file itself. It's all kept in one place. It's easier to use. Okay. GDAL gets much more complicated than this. I'm trying not to overwhelm you, but I do want you to know what options are available to you. So you can also play around with the compression of your files. We did this a little bit with homework 2, where I said, you don't actually need all of those different color values. You can take your data and represent it with a much smaller number of colors. GDAL does the same thing for satellite imagery. So a lot of these files are very large, but also very redundant. If you're taking an image over the ocean, most pixels might actually look the same. And you can use various different compression techniques to make the total file size much smaller. Then it's easier to transmit over the internet or takes up less space on your hard drive. So there's a ton of different compression options for most of the drivers that you just saw before. You can pick many different file formats and many different compression options. Every compression option has pros and cons. So some of them are faster during the compression process, some of them are faster during the decompression process, and some of them actually compress it to a smaller size. So depending on your constraints, how much data you need to transfer, how quickly you need to transfer it, how small it needs to be, you can try different compression options, but you probably won't need to do that in this course. This is a little bit more important, especially for machine learning. So there's actually different ways of storing an image on a computer. When you're storing things on a computer, the only thing you can store is numbers, right? We actually have a 3-dimensional matrix, but all we can really do is store a single linear vector. So you could store it like the image on the right, where you just go one row at a time, every pixel, and you store it like so. But in machine learning, what we often need to do is load these kind of small image patches like the one in red and train a model using this. So we're doing a lot of random sampling of small windowed patches. Because of that, there are other file formats like the one on the left where you can actually store adjacent blocks, and you can store each block in a row. So then if I need to read this area in red, the blocks I need to read into memory are the ones in yellow. And that one on the left is less things to read than the one on the right. So the one on the left, there's many different ways to refer to this. Any kind of block size greater than 0. If you see blocks in your geospatial metadata, this is what those blocks refer to. It's these little squares that we're loading. If it's a GeoTIFF, people often call these cloud optimized GeoTIFFs or COGs, and they're literally optimized for these kind of small windowed reading. We don't want to read the entire file into memory just to get access to a small patch of data, but we also don't want to read an entire row into memory to get that small patch either. Okay. And then this is the other thing that makes remote sensing kind of tricky. So whenever I talk to like computer scientists or computer vision researchers, they say, oh, it's just images. I work with images. It should be easy. One of the problems that you might have noticed during lecture 2 is that we have a lot of different types of sensors, and as a result, a lot of very different images. So for instance, different satellites will have a different number of spectral bands. We talked about synthetic aperture radar, which has 2 bands. We talked about Landsat, which has anywhere from 7 to 11 bands. We also talked about hyperspectral data, where you might have 250 bands. So there's not always just a simple RGB image. Sometimes you have many different bands far outside of the visible spectrum. So SAR sensors will be on one end of the spectrum, optical sensors will be on another end of the spectrum. There's very wide wavelengths of data that we're capturing for different sensors. It's not just the visible spectrum. Again, we saw this before, depending on your satellite and how much of the Earth's surface you are capturing, you have very different spatial resolutions as a result. So there's a lot of these geostationary weather satellites like GOES that have maybe 2 kilometers to 4 kilometers per pixel. So they're relatively zoomed out, but they can see a very large portion of the Earth. So you can see an entire hurricane in one picture. You can have higher resolution satellite imagery such as Maxar or Planet data, which gets you down to about 1 meter per pixel or even 30 centimeters per pixel. So you can get very high resolution data. You can even take a drone and fly it as low as you want and zoom in as much as you want. So you can imagine that if we're training a machine learning model on one of these sensors, and I want to use that machine learning model for a different sensor, it's going to say, what the hell is this? What are all these spectral bands that I've never seen before? What is this wavelength? Why do the objects of interest look completely different at this different resolution? So at the moment, and I'll talk about this towards the end of the course when we talk about foundation models, but at the moment, most of the models that you're training are very specific. They only work for one set of inputs and one set of outputs. And then last but not least, depending on the orbit of your satellite, or depending on whether it's a drone that you only get to fly once, or if it's just an official product produced by the government, you have very different temporal frequencies or repeat periods for data. So some of these very low resolution satellites like GOES, you might get an image every single day. Or if it's geostationary and it hovers over the same location, you might get more or less a continuous video. Whereas if it's an Earth observation satellite and it's more high resolution, it's in that polar or sun synchronous orbit, you might get an image every 2 weeks, and that's it. And if something important happens in the middle, you still have to wait for that next revisit. I showed this slide last week as well, but I want to show it one more time again. You'll see that depending on the satellite, even if you're only looking at these multispectral satellites that are relatively similar, they're still completely different. So Landsat has these thermal bands that Sentinel-2 doesn't have. Sentinel-2 has a lot more bands that are they have a very narrow bandwidth, so they're very specific about the information they're capturing. And then all of these, you'll notice, for example, Sentinel-2, we've got some bands at 10 meter resolution, some at 20 meter resolution, and some at 60 meter resolution, and very different bandwidths for each of those. So there's a lot of complexity just in relatively similar satellites. You cannot train a model naively on Landsat 8 and use it on Landsat 7 or use it on Sentinel-2. It's a very different type of image. Okay, so this is one of the things that makes remote sensing challenging. The bigger thing for any of you in GIS, you already know this quite well, but we have to deal with coordinate reference systems. So the Earth is a 3-dimensional sphere, more or less, but our images are 2-dimensional. So when we take an image of the Earth, we are losing a little bit of that 3D curvature. So we need some sort of projection to map this 3D surface onto a 2D image, and we need a coordinate reference system to refer back to the original three-dimensional structure, so we know where it's located on this sphere. There are a lot of different projections and coordinate reference systems out there. You're probably quite familiar with Mercator. This is what you see when you go on Google Maps. This is known as an equal angle projection, but not an equal area projection. So the shape of all of these continents and land masses looks correct. The area is completely wrong. So it looks like Greenland and Africa are about the same size. In reality, Africa is 15 times larger than Greenland. So they're completely distorted when you get to the poles. Now, this is just one projection. You could also use something like Albers equal area, which, as the name describes, is an equal area projection, but not an equal angle projection. So all of the shapes look weird, they look distorted, they look squished, but the area is correct. That is the actual size of Greenland compared to Africa. So these projections matter a lot, not just because of political reasons, but also because if you have data in two different projections, they're not going to line up, right? They're completely shifted and squished and distorted with respect to each other. You need all of your data to be in the same coordinate reference system. Those are two common ones, but there's literally thousands of other ones that will minimize distortion over land masses or over the ocean or only over one continent or country that you're studying at a time. So you will probably see hundreds of different coordinate systems with every new data set that you download. All of the data you find, there's not one correct coordinate system. All of them are correct and you will see all of them. Same with file formats. And then the last thing I want to talk about is resolution. So for instance, let's say you download Sentinel-2 and you download another data set as well. You notice that with Sentinel-2, there's some bands at 10 meter per pixel, some at 20 meter per pixel, some at 60 meter per pixel. You can't easily combine these data sets without resampling them to a common resolution. So for instance, if I have this image in black and each one of these grid cells is a picture, I could also have this image in red. It overlaps. And even though things are pretty well aligned, every pixel is a different size. I can also end up in a slightly different situation. So let's say I have two images and both of them have the exact same resolution. That does not mean that they are machine learning ready. My second image could be shifted by half a pixel, and I can't map one pixel to the other pixel. I need to shift this. So there's a couple things here. You have to make sure all of your data is in the same coordinate reference system. You also have to make sure it has the same resolution, and you also have to make sure that those grids are aligned. That last thing, that grid alignment, this in GDAL is known as target aligned pixels, or TAP. So if you see a flag -TAP, that's what it's referring to. It's making sure everything is on the same grid, not shifted. Okay. Now, I want to talk in more detail about some of the pre-processing that goes into multispectral imagery. Most of this stuff you actually don't need to do yourself. Most of this is done by ESA or NASA or the USGS or some government agency, some data provider who knows the satellite very well, knows the data very well, knows all of these pre-processing techniques. I still want to teach it to you for a couple different reasons. A lot of times, especially if you're working on rapid response after a natural disaster, you want this image and you want it now. And for these big organizations, there's millions of images and they would love all of them now, but there's a queue and it takes a lot of time to process every image. So if you want an image that's been perfectly located and corrected for all these different distortions, that might take a couple weeks. If you're doing rapid response for a natural disaster, a couple weeks isn't going to cut it. People are going to be dead in 2 weeks. So you want the raw image and you want to do the processing yourself. So I'll teach you how to do that, or at least what steps go into that. And most of you will hopefully never need to do this because it is quite challenging. I actually probably should have put this slide earlier in the lecture. When we talk about pre-processing in general, what we're talking about is converting our data to a format that is machine learning ready. So it's able to be processed in a machine learning model. We talked about this a little bit, basically every lecture. Machine learning models only know one thing, and that is numbers. If you try to give it your name, it's going to say, I don't know what that is. You need to give it numbers that represent your name. So oftentimes we're dealing with things that are not simple images. Images are obviously numbers. But what if we have categories? What if we have text? What if we have missing data? What if we have cloud cover? What if we have a satellite that's partially broken? All of these things can corrupt the data or change the data into something that cannot naively be put through a machine learning model. So this lecture is how to fix that. How to manipulate the data so it's uniform, so it's in the same coordinate reference system, the same resolution, how to convert everything to a numerical representation. If you have text, if you have categories, how do we represent these with numbers? And this is usually done for both training and validation testing. All the time, we always have to do this. Otherwise, the machine learning model doesn't know how to use our data. Okay, so multispectral imagery. These are more or less the 5 main steps that are required for you to convert an image taken by a satellite to an image that's actually useful for your research. The first one is radiometric calibration. So if you have a camera, regardless of whether it's in space or in your pocket, that camera is not measuring color. It is measuring the number of photons of a certain wavelength that hit a sensor. That is really just a random number. Like, it depends on how long your camera is open for and all these other factors. What we would really like is some measure of brightness, some physical units to represent our colors. So that process is known as radiometric calibration. We want to have some sort of physical units to calibrate our sensors so that regardless of how old the camera is or how long the shutter is open for, it still has the same meaning. So these values shouldn't change over time. There's a relatively complicated formula for this. You don't need to memorize it again with any of the math in this course. But these are some of the things that go into calculating this. So you need to, your goal is to have the amount of light radiated by the Earth, specifically at the top of the atmosphere. So there's other distortions and things that happen in the atmosphere. Our goal right now is just to get physical units for how much light is hitting the satellite, not how many photons are hitting the satellite. This depends on a few things, such as the angle of the sun, the angle of the satellite, but this is how this is calibrated. Usually with most of these sensors, you will calibrate it on the ground in a factory. So you'll say, here's a reference image. We know the exact color of this image. It's been calibrated against all of these other cameras. I can calibrate this camera. And then once you fly it into space, those numbers might not always stay the same. So it might start to drift over time. You might need to recalibrate it. So then you'll look at specific objects on the ground that, again, are basically large reference objects, and you can recalibrate it in space. You can change some of these numbers depending on brightness, depending on sensors just getting old. But this is a really important step. This gets us from number of photons, some raw digital number, to an actually usable measure of light with units. The second thing that's really important is geometric correction. So if you've got a satellite flying around the Earth, you kind of know where that satellite is, and you kind of know which direction the satellite is pointing. It's not always straight down. Sometimes it's at a slight angle. So if you do enough math, you kind of know where on the surface this image is. Depending on your satellite and how good that telemetry data is, older satellites, it's over here plus or minus a kilometer. Newer satellites, it's over here plus or minus 10 meters or 100 meters. So we're much better at it than we used to be. But if I'm trying to do time series analysis, where I've got an image of the same place taken every 2 weeks for an entire year, every pixel needs to be lined up with every other pixel, like perfectly lined up. If it's shifted by half a pixel, all of a sudden all of my analysis fails, and that building I was looking at is now moving around across time. We definitely don't want that. So we really want all of our pixels to be perfectly aligned with a relatively high degree of accuracy. How do we do this? exact same way as with calibration. So we look for specific known points of interest. They could be the boundaries of an island, like in this case. They could be specific large buildings that you can see in satellite imagery. They could be rocks in the middle of the Arctic that, this cliff has always been there, this mountaintop has always been there. Mountains don't really move with respect to each other on human timescales. So we can use these known reference points, these ground control points, to warp and distort our image onto the right shape. So this is basically everything required to get us from that raw image to that top of atmosphere image. So now our image has physical units, it has the right location. What else could be required beyond that? Another problem that you basically always face with satellite imagery is clouds. So at any given time, the Earth's surface is covered by about 75% in clouds. So 75% of your images, depending on where you are, will be cloudy, and they may or may not be useful. They might be partially cloudy, and half of the image is useful, and the other half of the image blows up your machine learning model and it doesn't know what to do. So cloud removal is really, really important. When I say cloud removal, I usually mean cloud masking. So can we at least know which pixels are useful and trustworthy and which pixels aren't? But it could also be actually trying to fill in the gaps and replace it with the image before and after, or something like that. I'll talk about that later. There's different kinds of clouds, unfortunately. The impossible ones, like the bright white pixels, those are usually labeled as cloud or thick cloud, but there's also a lot of thin cloud. So you can see the kind of lighter wispy areas nearby. These pixels, you might be able to see something in the underlying surface, like you might be able to see the outline of a building. You can tell if it's damaged or not, but the colors are pretty distorted due to the atmospheric effects of those clouds. So we also like to know where there's thin clouds. And then the other thing people forget about is clouds also have a shadow. So all of those very dark pixels in that image, that's the surface of the Earth. It just doesn't have as much light as the rest of the areas around it. So that will also greatly affect some of our machine learning models, some of our ability to extract information about the surface. So the goal is to get a very good cloud mask that tells you which pixels are trustworthy and which pixels are not so trustworthy. Okay, so the other thing we want to do, I mentioned there's all these kind of atmospheric distortion effects. So this could be things like clouds, this could be things like aerosols that scatter light and change color values. We would like to convert this top of atmosphere radiance to what we expect the actual surface reflectance is. So the goal is to see through the clouds, through the aerosols, at least the small ones that are possible. How do we do this? It's relatively based on physics. So you can kind of tell for different molecules that are commonly found in the atmosphere what scattering effects they might have. So there's common things like CO2 or water vapor that have a known pattern of scattering as a result. So you can do studies on this, and you can kind of figure out how to translate between radiance and top of atmosphere, how much of the light is likely as a result of scattering versus how much is true light from the surface. This is what the outcome looks like. So you see the image on the bottom. This is a typical top of atmosphere image. You can see it kind of looks hazy. That's the aerosols in the atmosphere. If you remove those and you do it well and you do it correctly, you should get an image like the one on the top. So if you're ever in a plane, especially you're very high up, if you look down, you'll probably see the thing on the bottom. But if you're on the surface of the Earth, it looks more like the thing on the top. It's actually bright, vivid colors. There's not as much haze when you remove the atmosphere. So that's the goal. None of these steps work perfectly, but the people who do this science are really, really smart. So they've done a lot of the hard work for us. One other thing that people always forget about is the Earth is, even if you think of it as a sphere, it's not a perfect sphere. We've got all these bumps and things. And satellites are not always looking directly down. If they did, they might have issues with light reflecting off of water bodies and things. So there's a lot of work required to deal with topographic effects. So basically, if you take an image and you take a model of the known elevation for that area, and you know, for example, the direction the satellite was pointing, you can correctly overlay this image and deal with any kind of topographic distortion. So it's really hard to see in this image, but the left image is what happens when the satellite is pointing at a 25-degree angle, and then the image on the right, things have been shifted just by a few pixels to line up correctly, so that regardless of which satellite is looking at which time and which angle they're pointing at, it will always be perfectly lined up. This is also really important in, for example, cities where you've got really tall skyscrapers. You don't want the top of that skyscraper to shift depending on the angle that the satellite is looking at. Also for reference, I know a lot of these things because I've actually had to do them. So 10, 12 years ago, we were working on a project where we were studying glaciers in the Arctic. And at the time, we had elevation models, but they weren't good. They were really blurry, they were really outdated, and they weren't really trustworthy. So we actually had to build our own elevation model, and then we had to do topographic correction and the ground control point, orthorectification, cross-registration between two images. We had to line up our images manually because there just weren't good images at the time. Nowadays, things are much better. Most of these big data centers and satellites have very well pre-processed data. You don't usually have to do this yourself, but if you want to know what they're doing for you, this is how to do it. And then last thing that people always forget, depending on the angle of the sun and the angle of the satellite, the surface of the Earth looks quite different. So there's this process known as bidirectional reflectance distribution function, or BRDF, where you can correct for differences in angle of both sun and sensor. What do I mean by this? So these images on the bottom here, we have one, I think these are spruces, black spruce forest. The middle one is soybeans, and then the right one is just barren field, it's just dirt. These two pictures, and these two pictures, and these two pictures, these are this exact same place at the exact same time, with the exact same angle of sun, amount of sunlight, everything. The only difference is you take a picture facing the sun or facing away from the sun. And the image that you get as a result looks completely different because of the angle that the light is hitting the surface. So if you're looking at a forest, if the sun is behind you, it's illuminating every single leaf of every tree. If the sun is on the other side of you, you're actually seeing a lot more shadows of those trees. Same with plants, you either get well-lit plants or you get not so well-lit with more reflections, and then same with soil as well. So we really want our images to look comparable, regardless of what time of day they were taken or what time of year they were taken. So this is really important for correcting for some of those changes just due to the angle of the satellite or the sun that result in images that look quite different from each other. I don't think I have time to show this, but if you want to learn more about all of the stuff that they're doing behind the scenes for you, specifically for Landsat, there's a bunch of really useful videos for this. I have them linked here and then again at the end of the slides. But they're basically telling you about how they process real data when it comes in. So sometimes the image is completely cloudy and there are no ground control points. You can't see the surface of the Earth. So it's impossible to know exactly where this is located. There's a whole tier for that kind of data where we have the image, we know where it is, plus or minus 100 meters, take it or leave it. It's still an image. You can still use it for certain applications like atmospheric or cloud studies, but you can't really compare it to the same place at different times. There's other data where they've got the ground control points so perfectly located that they know where this image is plus or minus 3 meters. And keep in mind that every pixel is 30 meters by 30 meters. So they're shifting things by just a few amount of meters based on the limited information they have in the image. So these are really cool videos that explain how the USGS does processing for Landsat images. There's similar things for Sentinel-1 or Sentinel-2 out there. So that's all the pre-processing required for multispectral images. We don't cover hyperspectral imagery too much in this course, but I want to give you a flavor of some of the things that are required for hyperspectral image processing. It's more or less the same as what you already have to do for multispectral imaging, plus extra steps. So again, if you've forgotten, the reason we're doing hyperspectral is instead of focusing on a few different colors that we know are important for certain applications. So near infrared is really important for agriculture and forestry for a lot of these plant processes. Thermal is really important for other applications. Instead of focusing on these known wavelengths that we think are important, with a hyperspectral satellite, we capture every wavelength. And we capture very, very fine, almost continuous distributions of wavelengths across the whole spectrum. And the goal is that we can actually separate very similar looking things by their spectral signature. So this is almost like a fingerprint, almost like a mass spectrometer flying around the Earth, taking images. You should be able to measure very minute changes in things. So for example, if you're looking at rocks or soil, you should be able to see differences in the chemical composition of that soil. So you could be doing mineral exploration studies, looking for new deposits of minerals that haven't been discovered yet. I know people who are looking at forests in Switzerland, and they're not only trying to tell where forest is and where forest isn't, they're also trying to tell what species of tree is this blurry little pixel in this image. And then they're trying to go even further where they're saying there's actually different varieties of this species. Can we tell the difference between these different varieties and their resilience to environmental effects? So you can use this to differentiate very similar things. For hyperspectral imagery, we basically do the same steps that we just did for multispectral. So the geolocation stuff, the orthorectification stuff, BRDF correction, etc., plus a bunch of other things that are somewhat unique to hyperspectral data. So the first is denoising. So one of the problems that you notice with hyperspectral sensors, because we're trying to capture a very narrow wavelength of the electromagnetic spectrum, our sensor does not allow a lot of photons in. And as a result, you get 6 photons plus or minus 5. So you get a lot of noise as a result of this very narrow bandwidth. And so you need to be able to remove that noise. There's other sources of noise as well. There could be thermal noise from the sensor itself, quantization noise. I was just talking about the photon noise. But there's a lot of noise, especially in hyperspectral sensors. Also, if you want to, so the other thing that you can do, instead of denoising, you can just zoom out and capture a bigger area, but then you lose all of your resolution. So we're really pushing the boundaries of how far you can zoom in, how small of an area you can capture, and how small of a wavelength you can capture. How do we do denoising? The most common approach is this non-local meets global algorithm. I won't go through it in too much detail. Here's the actual algorithm if you want to dig through it. But basically it's an iterative algorithm. So instead of calculating something once and you're done, you calculate it and then you calculate it again and again and again until it stabilizes. So if you kind of randomize some of these noise pixels, eventually you notice that all of the noise you can filter out and the result is very stable. It doesn't have as many problems with these different noise sources. So that's one approach to doing denoising. Another really cool thing that you can do with satellites is called pan sharpening. So we saw a lot of these satellites, especially like the multispectral satellites, or even some of the very high resolution satellites. They have high spatial resolution, but they lack that spectral resolution. So they just see a very highly resolved image, but you only see red, green, blue. Whereas if you want to get more spectral resolution, such as a hyperspectral sensor, you have to sacrifice that spatial resolution so that you can get more photons, you can get more accurate colors for a very small bandwidth. There are also sensors like you've seen already with Landsat and Sentinel-2, where different spectral bands have different resolution. So for example, with Landsat, almost all of the bands have 30 meter per pixel resolution, but there's one really wide bandwidth called the panchromatic band that has 15 meter per pixel resolution. So we do know some high resolution information, but we don't know it for all of our colors. So can we do data fusion and basically get the best of both worlds? So this is an example here. On the left, we've got a very low spatial resolution hyperspectral image. In the middle, we've got a high resolution multispectral image. We can actually use information from both and fuse them to get super resolved hyperspectral imagery that is actually based on physics and science, not on guessing. You can also do this with machine learning, and that's essentially guessing or pattern matching, but this is actually based on known high resolution and high spectral resolution information. How do you do this? You use coupled non-negative matrix factorization. Again, not something I'm going to teach in this course, but there is math involved in all of these pre-processing steps. Another problem unique to hyperspectral data is we actually have the problem of too much data. So instead of an RGB image where you've got 1,000 pixels by 1,000 pixels by 3, now we've got 250 different colors. So this is a huge big data problem. Your computer is barely going to be able to fit this image in memory. Your machine learning model is going to struggle with that much data. So oftentimes, we will actually not use all of the information we'll capture. We'll only use the parts that are relevant to us. So yeah, big problems with computational complexity. The other problem is, as you would expect, if something is bright red, it's probably also bright red plus half a nanometer and minus half a nanometer. So there's a lot of correlation between nearby spectral bands, which results in spectral redundancy. We don't actually need all of that information. The problem is we don't really know which information we do need. There's a lot of different ways to reduce dimensionality that all have their own pros and cons. The most traditional process would be if I can figure out which bands I actually need, I just use those. So this works if you're really just studying one specific material. You know exactly what is unique about that material compared to things that look similar. Maybe there's a spike in the electromagnetic spectrum at one specific wavelength or two wavelengths. You only need those. So you throw away the rest of the data. If you don't know which bands you need, then what do you do? So there's a lot of different transforms based on singular value decomposition that you can use to essentially learn the most important or most unique parts of the electromagnetic spectrum. So for instance, let's say we have an image of a location and we have 250 different colors for that image. But there's really two dominant colors. I can find the exact wavelength that matters the most in my information by doing something like principal component analysis and finding out which subset of that data is most important to me. So this is another common way to remove a little bit of the dimensionality without losing that unique information. Another really cool trick that you can do, especially for lower resolution imagery, where you do really want to be able to separate out pixels and zoom in, you can do a process called spectral unmixing. So if you look at the image on the right, we have two different materials on the surface of the Earth. We have this blue pixel, there's a blue thing on the Earth, and we have yellow, there's a yellow thing on the Earth. And then all of those green pixels you see, part of that pixel is that blue thing, part of that pixel is that yellow thing. The result is a blurry green blob. We would like to be able to figure out what is in that green pixel. Is it half blue, half yellow? Is it 1/4 blue, 1/4 yellow? Or is there another completely different color mixed in that we don't know about? The result that we're really looking for is pixel-wise probability for these different end members, these different pure pixels for every pixel in my image. And this is known as spectral unmixing. So we're decomposing the spectral signature of these pixels with multiple colors into their constituents, into their components. How do we do this? There's a pixel purity index that you can use where you basically look for extrema, basically very unique and simplified color spectra. And then all of the other colors that you see are actually just a superposition of two different color spectra. So if you remember Fourier series, that exact same idea. You can have two different wavelengths, and if you add them together, you get a more complicated thing. We're trying to understand what are the actual unique wavelengths, the unique spectra of these materials. Yeah, so that's the probability portion of this. And there we're just using least squares, aka linear regression, aka machine learning. So you can use machine learning for some of these pre-processing steps as well. And I think this is the last one, spectral matching. So let's say you've got those pure color components. You know the exact wavelength of this pixel or one material within this pixel. How do we actually tell what this material is? So nowadays, and mostly in this course, we're using machine learning. We're learning what these things mean. But this is actually not the way that most people use hyperspectral sensors. Oftentimes what you do is you build your own mini database of known reference materials. So you actually go out in the field and say, here's 5 different bricks that I found. Here's the exact hyperspectral signature of these bricks. Or you go and collect leaves from different species of trees, and you take them back to the lab, you photograph them with a hyperspectral sensor, and you say, this is the exact hyperspectral sensor signature of this species of leaf under these growth conditions. You know, hopefully there's not too much delay between picking the leaf and photographing it. And you get something that looks kind of like this, but with a lot more detail. So instead of tree, you would have hundreds of different species of trees. But each one of those materials will look slightly different, will have slightly different peaks in the electromagnetic spectrum. So we're not just measuring red, green, and blue, we're measuring hundreds of different spectral bands, and most things are unique in at least one of these dimensions. Okay, so this is all of the pre-processing that is usually done for you. The second half of lecture is all the processing that you need to do yourself. I think we can take like a 5-minute break and let people stretch their legs and go to the restroom. So let's say 4:07, we continue. I don't want to just talk straight for 2 hours, but I also want to finish on time so you can go home early and enjoy this beautiful weather. So we'll reconvene at 4:07 and you can take a break or ask questions or whatever. In the second half of the lecture, we're going to be working with real data. You've already downloaded a Sentinel-2 image. We also want to work with a vector file. So for your homework assignment, we're going to be using this Eurocrops dataset, which is on Zenodo. I will pick this. It's taking a while to load. Check to see if you're on the newest version. There is a newer version available. So I went from version 3 to version 11. Okay, that's better. And then just download the zip file for any country that you're interested in. Is AT Austria? I don't know European country abbreviations.
Yeah.
Okay, we're downloading it. And it might take a minute to download. So we'll use that in the second half of the course. This data set was actually developed by TOOM by some people who work right upstairs. They're not in our chair, but they're in the neighboring chair. So this is a really cool data set. It's basically just a map of agriculture across all of Europe for almost every country. It's very well put together.
3.
Yep.
So I did the hyperparameter tuning.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, it's not good, let's say.
That's okay.
But is it still fine?
Yeah. So especially for the first several homeworks, there's no requirements for accuracy. Some of the like homework 7 or 8, I'll specifically say like get at least 80% accuracy or 80% F1 or something. But for these, I'm more interested in, can you do the process correctly? So don't worry too much about accuracy yet. It like should work. Like it shouldn't be like a random noise. It should be better than random guessing, but it doesn't have to be great. We're still using very simple models, so as we get fancier and fancier models, you should expect the accuracies to get better over time. Especially right now, we're really not using any spatial information. We're just looking at one pixel at a time and labeling that pixel based on everything we know. So as soon as we add in that spatial information, it should get much better. Okay. Let's continue. And I'm actually gonna get rid of this because I'm gonna be doing a lot of typing. So this is where you can follow along if you have your images downloaded, your vector files downloaded, and you have GDAL or Raster.io or Fiona installed. Okay, so going back to these slides. So the first thing that you should always do whenever you get geospatial data is learn about that data, what kind of information is present in that data. So if I go to the command line, again, if you're not used to the command line, Mac, Linux, they all have this terminal thing. There's really only one option. Windows, there's like 4 different terminals you can choose from, and they all have completely different syntax. So good luck. But if you choose the WSL option, which is the Windows subsystem for Linux, then you can run the same commands as every other Linux and Mac person. So I can use something like CD to change directory and go to wherever I have my data downloaded. It could be in your downloads folder. It could be in this random folder for this course. So I've got some Sentinel data that I downloaded 2 weeks ago, and I would like to learn more about this data. Let's take a look at this specific directory. So this is this .safe format that Sentinel uses. I can use the find command, and that will just recursively tell me all the files in here. So find directory or dot, and I will get a list of all of this. So within that folder, there's this granule folder, and then there's this L2A folder. 2 here refers to level 2A. So this is level 2. It's already been atmospherically corrected. This is our surface reflectance. Within there, we've got some metadata in here, which might be useful. And we have our image data, which is definitely useful. So let me go into this directory. So there's this data strip. I actually don't remember what this is. This metadata, okay. There's the granule, which contains the image, and then there's an HTML thing that contains some user information about the data, like basically tiny little image version of your data so you know what it kind of looks like. So we're going to go into granule. So CD into granule, CD into the specific data here. We have our auxiliary data, which contains, I don't know what these are. I'm going to use Vim. If you know what you're doing, you can use this. If you don't, you're going to get stuck if you do this. Yeah, this is a binary file format. I don't know what all this stuff is. The stuff I want is the image data. Within here, as I mentioned, there's different spectral bands with different resolutions. So I can look in all 3 of these. In the 10 meter one, I can see band 2, 3, 4, and 8. And then all of these other files are simply metadata referring to that. Within the 20 meter resolution folder, I still see bands 2, 3, 4, and 8 that have been resampled to a lower resolution, but now I see even more bands that I can use. And then at 60 meters, we have all of our information resampled at that. I obviously want to use the highest resolution for bands 2, 3, 4, and 8, and the second highest resolution for things that are available at 20 meters. I only use the 60 meter when that's my only option. So let's take a look at one of these 10 meter resolution files. So if we look at the slides, if you have GDAL installed, you can do GDAL info. If you don't and you have raster.io installed, you can use Rio space info. And it will get you slightly different things. But if I do GDAL info on this, which file is this? Oh, this might be the RGB one I made 2 weeks ago. Let me do GDAL info on band 2, 10 meter resolution. So I already showed you this, I think, but I want to reiterate. There's a bunch of information that we can see here. For example, this .jp2 file, this is an OpenJPEG file, so that's the driver that GDAL is using to load that. That's one of those 160 different raster drivers that GDAL supports. This is the file name, we know that. This is the size of the file, the number of dimensions, so 10,000 by 10,000 pixels. 10,000 times 10,000 is 100 million? Sounds right. 100 million pixels per color. So if you have 12 spectral bands, then you've got 1.2 billion. That's math, right? So we've got 1.2 billion pixels per image that we download. This is very large data, right? We're usually not working with a single image, we're working with hundreds or thousands of images. So you can very quickly fill up your hard drive. For all the homework assignments, I try to keep things relatively simple, one file at a time. We learned about coordinate reference system. This one is specifically in UTM zone 26 north. So this is a universal transverse Mercator. You take the entire Earth and you divide it up into little sections, and each section is relatively undistorted, but those sections don't overlap. So kind of imagine you take an orange and you peel that orange and you keep little thin strips where you can kind of squish it down to a flat surface, but you end up with all of these distortions where things split away. This is all the information you need to know to reproduce this coordinate system exactly. For most of these, there is this magic number called an EPSG code, and that has a very specific meaning. So if I do, what did I say, EPSG, and then the number, there's this epsg.io website where you can look up what every one of these numbers means, and it tells you exactly what it is, what units it has, what the reference, the coordinate reference system is with respect to, when it was created, when it was last revised, etc. So this happens to be in Greenland. That's the data I downloaded 2 weeks ago. It's in this UTM zone because it looks good for this little thin strip. But we can get some of these things from here. So we can see meters, Greenland, Iceland. So this is good for some of those locations. Cool. This is the origin. Again, we're not in latitude, longitude coordinates. We're in meters with respect to some random reference point in this box. So these numbers themselves should not have a lot of meaning to you, but you can get back to this map via those numbers. Every pixel is 10 meters by 10 meters. You will often notice that different file formats and different software libraries read images in different ways. So usually the X, you start from the left corner and you go right, obvious. For Y, it really depends. And a lot of times they'll actually start measuring from the top left corner and go down. So that's why our Y coordinate is negative. This is quite common. Other people will do positive, so starting at the bottom and going upwards. GDAL knows how to deal with the differences here. Compression, so we have lossless compression, so this is not compressed at all. There's a little bit of compression where we basically squish duplicates, but we're not like going at a lower color channel resolution to make the file smaller. So it is lossless compression. These are all the coordinates of our image, etc. This is the block size. If you remember that thing where I showed the image with the grid and the red square and the yellow colors, that's how big our blocks are. So if we want to load any given image patch, let's say a 256 by 256 pixels, if we're lucky and we're within that block, we only have to load that block into memory to get the 256 by 256. If we're on the boundary of 2 pixels, we have to load 2 pixels, etc. uint 16, so it's 0 to big number, 2 to the 16, 0 to 65,000, but we probably don't use all of those. It's probably closer to uint 12. So 2 to the 12th, about 5,000, or somewhere in that range. Quit. Okay. Yeah, I think that's all the information we can get from this file. So that's how we can extract information. Again, if we use Rio info on this file name, what was I running this one? This will get us almost all of the exact same information, but now it's in JSON format. So this works well with other tools like JQ that you can use to process JSON metadata. You can also use Python as a built-in JSON module that you can use to read this. Okay. You can also get statistics. So if you want to know like min, max, mean, median, you can do that with something like gdal-info-stats or rio-info-stats. So there's a little bit of an inconsistency there that might confuse you. Okay, we did this before. So if I've got a bunch of different images for different channels, such as red, green, blue, near infrared, shortwave infrared, I can stack these into one file using gdal merge -separate or with Rio stack. If I have a bunch of images from different locations and I want to merge these into one mosaic, I can also do that with the same gdal merge command or with Rio merge. So now instead of using -separate, I'm just merging them, and I've got maybe 3 or more files with all colors, and I want one big file for the entire area. So this is for merging, for mosaics. For all of these, there's pretty good documentation online. So for instance, let me go to this first one, gdal merge. These are all the options you can run, basic description of what it's for. There is a help message. It is sometimes helpful and sometimes not. Yeah, so that's not really helpful to me. This is much more helpful, so I want all of the information. You can specify the output file name, the output file format. So I could, for example, convert this from JPEG to GeoTIFF using -OF. Creation options, maybe I'll talk about later. That's kind of detailed. Output type. So if I want to change it from uint 16 to something else, I can. Pixel size. So if I have a bunch of files and they have different resolutions, I can make them into a mosaic and I can say which resolution to use. Target aligned pixels we talked about earlier. So if I've got a bunch of images, I want to make sure they're lined up in a grid. I can specify the dimensions. So if I don't want a mosaic of the entire area, just a smaller area, I can do that. Verbose versus quiet, if you want logging information. Put files into separate bands. Pseudo color, I don't even know what that is. No data pixels for specific bands, etc. And then there's examples like common things that you might want to do and how to do it. So this documentation is really useful. Please use it. There's not that many commands, and you only really need to know like 3 or 4 to do most things. So if you're struggling with the homework, this is really the first place to go. But those are some common things with stacking and mosaicing. Translation. So this is another very common operation. So if you have a file and you just want to change the file type to a new file format, there's a gdal translate command for this and also a Rio convert command for this. So you can do -if for the input file format Usually it can automatically detect this, so this isn't needed. You can also do -OF for the output file format. For example, GeoTIFF would be GTIFF, or JP2 might be OpenJPEG. And then you specify the input file and the output file. So it's relatively straightforward. It's pretty easy to convert file formats here. If you remember earlier, I mentioned there's this creation option things. One such creation option is using tiled blocks as opposed to little strips. So if you want that cloud optimized GeoTIFF that has those blocks that are easy to read without reading the entire row, you can use -CO tiled equals yes, and then now your file is quicker to do random windowed reading. Okay. Reprojection, this is really important. This one you will actually need to do on the homework. So there is a GDAL warp command or a RIO warp command that you can use to do this. Let me just show the documentation for this. So you can see there's a lot of different options here. Skip this. This is the source coordinate reference system. Most of the time the file contains the reference system, so it can figure it out. If the file doesn't contain this metadata, you can tell it what coordinate system it's in using this -S SRS. -T SRS, this is the target CRS or SRS, same thing. So this is the projection, the coordinate reference system that you want to switch to. So I could, for example, switch my data from UTM zone 26 north to 27 north, a little bit, I forget if it's east or west, but that direction. There's different ways to describe this coordinate reference system. So there's those EPSG codes that I mentioned. There's also these proj strings, so these might be longer and more detailed. When you're warping, you might want to change like how complicated and fancy the algorithm is when it needs to do resampling. Error threshold, if you want to do it faster and allow some sacrifice in accuracy. This is the target extent. So if you only need to get a small portion of the file, you don't have to reproject the entire file. You can reproject a small area. And this is in the target coordinates. So even before you reproject it, you can say, I want the data that will be in this area. If you want the data that was in this area and reproject that data, use this other thing instead. Target resolution, so you can change the resolution of the image very easily. So this is not only for reprojecting, but also for resampling, which you will need to do for the homework assignment. So if you've got these sentinel images where they're different spatial resolutions, you need to resample them. You need to warp them to a higher resolution. Again, target aligned pixels will be useful. You can also do the output file size in pixels. Be careful with this. Usually it's easier to specify the resolution you want, not just the file dimensions you want. Output file type again, resampling method. So by default, it's just doing nearest neighbors. If you want higher accuracy, higher resolution, more detailed, you can do something like bilinear or cubic or these other fancier methods of resampling data without just looking for the nearest pixel. And then the rest of this isn't super important. So there's a lot of different options here. They're not always necessarily useful for you. So use whichever ones you think you might need to use, or whatever I suggest here. So here I'm reprojecting this source.tiff file to a new coordinate reference system. I'm going from EPSG 5070 to 4326. You can look up what those mean. You can do the same thing with RIO warp. I can also crop my file. I can say xmin, ymin, xmax, ymax, and then I get a new smaller file. You can do the same thing with RIO clip. Resampling, I mentioned this already. You can also use GDAL warp for this. and you just specify the target resolution. So if I've got something that's 60 meters per pixel, I can change it to 10 meters per pixel by doing this. Same thing with rear warp. And again, you might want to do this with target aligned pixels if you have multiple images and you want to make sure they all line up. Spectral indices. This is actually really fun. So if you remember from the lecture 0, we talked about these spectral indices that you can calculate, things like NDVI, which is really just near infrared minus red divided by near infrared plus red. I can actually do this math on the command line and generate an output file that is the spectral index. And this is what it might look like. So there's a GDAL calculator program and also a raster.io calculator program. They work completely differently, and this is always really fun to explain. So the GDAL one makes perfect sense. I have one file, which I will call A, and maybe it has multiple bands, so I will call band 1A. And then for file B, it's actually the same file, it's just a different band of that file. And then I can calculate A plus B divided by 2 and save it to this file. With raster.io, this should look really confusing to you, and that's completely normal. So what is it doing here? Let me get some chalk. So all of this is weirdly wet. All of the math that you've ever seen in your entire life uses what is called infix notation. So if I want to do, this is not going to work at all, let me get a new chalk. If I want to do 2 plus 2, it's written like this. You've got one number, you've got the other number, and the operator is in between the two. This is how you think math works. This is how math usually works. This is not how math has to work. So what raster.io is using is actually called prefix notation. So I can write this same thing as plus 2, 2. And the goal is to add two things together. We'll see this more next week because this is actually quite common in functional programming. Our function is addition. Our inputs are 2 and 2. This is just a different way of writing things, but it is actually the same thing. So if I look at this Rio calc line, first I'm going to do division. What am I going to do division of? This thing and 2. What is this thing? I am actually going to do addition. What am I adding? Band 1 of file 1, band 2 of file 1. This is the same thing down here for NDVI. So I can say this is my near infrared file, this is my red file, calculate n minus r divided by n plus r. You can, I don't know why you would want to, but you can write this like this, where you do division of these two things. The left thing is the subtraction of file 1 and file 2. The right thing is the addition of file 1 and file 2. And that's the same way of writing it, but using prefix notation instead of infix notation. I don't know why raster.io decided that this made sense. It is powerful. It is really cool. There's a lot of nice mathematical guarantees about functional programming. We'll talk about this more next week in the cloud computing lecture, but if you ever get confused looking at this, that's how it works. That's what's going on. It's really the same thing. It's just a different way of writing it. Why does all of this matter? So I'm going to teach you about fancier tools later in this course, such as TorchGeo, that can do a lot of the things that I'm describing for you automatically. If you know how to do it, you can do it yourself, and the result is much, much faster. So here what we're seeing is, if we just look at the left group here, in blue, this is what it looks like if you just load your data into memory and you ask GDAL to do all of the preprocessing for you. You do the reprojection, you do the resampling, you load a small patch of data, and you don't do any of the pre-processing ahead of time. You can see we can load, I don't know, 40 images per second, which is good. We can load a bunch of data. If I take that exact same data and I do all of the reprojection and resampling ahead of time, I get to the orange column where I can do 130 patches per second. So now we're working much faster with the same data, the same file formats, the same file sizes. If I also enable GDAL's cache so that it's reusing blocks that it's already loaded from disk, I can get all the way up to the red line, and I can load 700 patches per second. And now we're getting to the point where the GPU can be kept busy because we can quickly and easily load as much data as it needs. The GPU doesn't need to wait for the data to be loaded from disk. So this stuff does matter. It makes your code way faster if you do it all ahead of time before you start machine learning. You can also do it in the middle of the machine learning process. It's just kind of slow. Okay, so everything I just showed you was for raster files. I also want to show you for vector files. So if you had time to do this during break, we're going to be using this Eurocrops dataset on the homework assignment. You can find it on, if you just Google Zenodo Eurocrops and you make sure you're on the latest version, you should be fine. And then you can scroll down and you can just pick a zip file for any country of interest. So I downloaded AT, which the audience has guaranteed is Austria, and I'm counting them if I'm wrong. So actually, I think I downloaded another one here. Let me go back up. Okay, and then I downloaded some Eurocrops data, and I have Deutschland and NRW, North Ref something Vine or some. I don't know the states of Germany, unfortunately, but this is one of the states of Germany. I can view this in GIS, which I should probably do, but it's going to take me a minute to load this. But before I do so, I will do this OGR info command on our file. You'll notice there's actually a lot of files here. Some of these I created later with GDAL, but let me just show you some of one of the original files. So I'll do OGR info. I believe this is the original file. There's a bunch of different files here, .dbf, .prg, .shape. dbf is the actual labels for the file. PRG is the projection. Shape is the actual geometries. So it's one vector file stored in multiple different files, each component one at a time. I will do OGR info on one of these, and I will tell QGIS to calm down. That's okay, I don't care. Okay, OGR info, my file.shp. And it doesn't really tell me a lot of information. It tells me that it's using the ESRI shapefile driver. Good, that makes sense based on the extension. And it tells me layers within the file. So one file can have multiple different layers. What is a layer? If you've ever used like Photoshop and you know different layers of an image that you can overlay on top of each other, exact same thing. For the sake of example, let's say one layer is buildings, another layer is highways, another layer is property boundaries or something like that. So this file has multiple layers. I can investigate one specific layer by giving it the name of the layer I care about. So in that case, it would be this. And now it spits out millions of lines of information for me. So what is it telling me? If I go back to the top of this, again, we have the driver name, we have the layer name now, some metadata when it was last updated. Everything in this file is polygon geometries. They don't have to be, they could be points, they could be lines, they could be multi-polygons, but these are all simple polygons. There are 2,746 polygons. This is the bounds of the entire file. Here is our projection. Again, UTM zone 32 north, so this is a different location now. We're not in Greenland anymore, we're in Germany. So we increase and then we go east, I guess. That makes sense. Again, meters, etc. These are all the fields that are allowed in each feature. So for instance, there is a field ID. That's just an integer. There's some kind of inspire ID that's a string. Don't know what this is. This is the area of each cropland field in hectares. There is some sort of integer code and text code for that field. Don't know what most of the rest of these are. And then there's these things, and these are actually semi-important. So what is Eurocrops? I should probably start with that. Basically, someone from TUM took all of the public information about agriculture in most countries of Europe, and they combined them into one big data set. And every country has completely different information. They have different crops that they're growing with different names and different languages. They use different integer values to represent them. Eurocrops takes all of these and harmonizes them under one classification system in one language. And these are some of the error code, some of the crop names that you can find. So this is the crop name in English. This is a machine readable name that's always the same number of digits. And then this one is the actual integer code that represents our data. But it's in string format for some reason. Yeah, that's right. Okay. What does a feature look like? Here is our first feature, this big thing. Feature 0 of this layer. Here is this ID. Here is a URL that tells you more information about this type of field. Here is the area in hectares. Here is the code. I don't know German, but I know English, and that means grassland. So that makes sense. So this field at the moment, it's not growing anything other than grass. Here is that Eurocrops code that we can use to refer to it, and there's the long name. This is the actual polygon, basically the set of XY points that trace the entire field. And there's tens of thousands of these for every country, every state across Europe. Let's see if we can find something more interesting than grassland. We have maize or corn, depending on what country you're from. So this is maize. Winter wheat. Winter barley. So there's a lot of different crop species in here. My QGIS has loaded now, so I will open a new empty project and I will load this file. And it is pretty deep in my hierarchy. Okay. And I think we were looking at this one. Oh, this is the one that I cropped. This is not the original. This is the original. Okay, now we have a big one. Okay. So I could add some country boundaries, but this is the whole shapefile for the state of Germany, and it's taking a second to load because it's very large. Yes. So that is every agricultural field in the entire state. There's a bunch more of these for other states and other countries. If I zoom into any one location, I can see more details. At the moment, this isn't very useful. Every field is the same color. I can change this by going into layer properties, going into labels, and using single labels, I can select which of those many feature values I want to use. So I could color it by area, but I'll try to color it by the type of agriculture. Let's see if it works with this one. Okay, at the moment they're still all the same color, so I think I need to change the color bar somewhere. Is it this one? Okay, that's useless.
I think we need to change that. Yeah.
Oh yes, you were right. Symbolism, color. No, I don't want simple fill. I want rule-based fill. Is that how it works? It's been a while since I've done this.
Yeah, that single symbol is there right in the top.
Oh yes, there we go.
Category.
I'm so happy that there's people who know this better than I do. So we can do colored symbology. We can pick any one of these things, and random color ramp is fine with me. And we have to click,
Classify.
yes, click classify. And that says, like, for the entire file, these are all the possible color values. This is what they're going to be. And I can apply them. And now all of a sudden, every field is a different color. At the moment, the label is useless because I need to go back here and change it to the name. And now if we zoom in a little bit more, we should be able to see more information. So now we can see the actual name of the agricultural crop growing in every field everywhere. So these are all winter wheat in pink. This is winter barley in red. I don't know triticale, but that's another crop, I guess. And yeah, it's a lot of stuff. So you'll if you explore this data, you'll find that different places around Europe grow completely different crops. So here's a bunch of, what is this? Would be grassland, forest. So there's not so much forest in this area compared to other parts of Germany. So this is a way to do some data exploration in QGIS, very useful. We did OGR info on this, and we found all of these things. We can look at one field at a time. We can look at all the fields in GIS. You can do a lot of the same things that we talked about earlier. You can create a mosaic of multiple different vector files. So if I download the file for every state in Germany, I can combine them to one big shapefile for all of Germany using OGR merge. Another thing that I should point out, which is endlessly confusing to me and hopefully to everyone else, when you use the GDAL commands like GDAL warp, you did GDAL warp, input file, output file. All of the OGR commands are swapped. So you do OGR to OGR, output file, input file. So this is a common source of confusion, a common mistake that people make. I haven't shown you too much of this, but there is actually a new GDAL command in very recent versions of GDAL where I can just do GDAL raster stack or GDAL vector merge or various other things. And it's much simpler, much more uniform, much easier to use. You can use this if you want to. The reason I'm not teaching it is because it's really new and it's still not stable, so they're still working things out and changing things. But maybe starting next semester, I'll start teaching the newer way to do this with GDAL. So if you use the old way, it's OGR to OGR. If you use the new way, I think it's GDAL vector convert, which is pretty logical, but more typing. So I can say the input file type is the shape file, and I want an output file type of GeoJSON. Here is my output file name, here is my input file name. So source and destination are reversed. You can also do this with Fiona. It's a little bit more complicated. You actually have to concatenate the file out to the command line and then pipe it into another command that loads it in GeoJSON format. Load here actually means save to disk. So I find this extremely confusing. This is slightly better. So that's how to convert file formats. Reprojection, again, something that you always need to do. You can use OGR to OGR. The source, which usually detects by default, but if you can't automatically detect it, you can tell it. And then the target CRS for your destination and source files. Same thing with Fiona. And then finally, you often need to convert your vector file to a raster format. you can use GDAL rasterize or Rio rasterize to do that. Obviously, you need to specify the resolution you want to use. So what is the actual resolution of your file? You might also want target aligned pixels. When you're converting a vector to a raster, you need to tell it what the pixel values are supposed to be. So I can say for my shapefile, let's say I have a shapefile of every building. I will say convert the building height to the numerical value for each pixel. And then every building in my raster will have a different value for the height. Or maybe I just want it to be binary and I don't specify any attribute. I just say building or not building, and then it's 0 or 1. Specify the layer to use, and then the input shapefile and the output TIFF file, because it's a GDAL command, it's in the normal order. So it's, again, confusing, as you've noticed. You can do the same thing with raster IO. You specify the resolution, which property to use. I think we don't even need to specify the layer because it's the first one by default, and then the input and output file names. So if we wanted to rasterize our, maybe I'll make this bigger. If we wanted to rasterize our Eurocrops data, we could pick any one of these things. We would probably want to pick a number. Every country has this Eurocrops code. You can use this if you want to. You can also use this because from reading the documentation, I find that this is a unique ID, not for each field, but for each crop. So this is also fine to use. But I wouldn't want to use area or one of these string names. That wouldn't be as useful. I also wouldn't want to use the year. Okay, so that's the rasterization. Okay, how are we doing on time? We're running out of time. Let me quickly go through a few remaining things that you might need to do for preprocessing, and then I'll show you the homework. Okay, so one of the things that you might need to do is data imputation. Again, there's a lot of reasons why, your data might have problems. For example, sensor failure, or sensor replacement, or sensor saturation, or also cloud cover, of course. This is an example from Landsat 7. So I think I mentioned this 2 weeks ago. Landsat 7, there's this push broom camera that just slides back and forth and takes an image. And there's this little thing that swivels it up and down so that you don't get overlap. So it's supposed to do this kind of booster-photonic search pattern. Instead, it does this because that scanline corrector thing broke. So the resulting image, it looks completely fine in the middle. And as you get closer and closer to the outside of your image, you get these messed up pixel values. When you have missing values in your data, they might be represented in very different ways. So always check your file. Usually GDAL info will tell you what the no data value is. It might be represented as negative 9,999. It might be represented as 0. In NumPy or Pandas, it might be represented as not a number or not a time, or it's also referred to as a no data value. But these all mean the same thing. It's just some value in our image where we don't know because there is no information. There's a bunch of different ways to fill gaps in data, whether those gaps are because of sensor failure or because of clouds. You could just use a constant value. Let's say this is the mean value of the whole image. You could use nearest neighbors. So what's the nearest location where we do know something? You could use a fancier polynomial, and you could even use time series. So if you have multiple images, if this image is cloudy, what was the image before it? Fill in the gap. So here's an example from that Landsat 7 SLC off, where you can use, I forget which one of those techniques this image was. Yeah, it doesn't say in my notes, but it looks pretty decent. So I'm guessing it's either some kind of fancy time series thing, or also a machine learning technique could be used to fill in the gaps here. So that's some examples of data imputation, why you might need to do it and how you can do it. Another thing that you might need to do is encoding. So we've seen a lot of examples of categorical outputs. So if I am trying to classify an image, there's one of 10 classes that it's allowed to be. This is relatively easy to do in machine learning. If you remember from 2 lectures ago, we saw, I don't know, 3 lectures ago, if you remember the pizza versus not pizza, we know how to do multi-class classification. We just have a bunch of one versus rest classifiers that vote. So we know how to do categorical outputs. That's just a classification problem. What happens if you have a categorical input? So the input to your model has categories. I mentioned that all of our inputs have to be represented as numbers. Let's say we have this cropland data layer mask where I have pixel labels for everything. I'm not trying to learn this. I'm using this as input. And maybe the thing I'm trying to predict is irrigation, how much water is used for every pixel in this image. So this is now an input. And I can represent it with these cute colors, but these colors don't actually have any meaning. They're just arbitrary colors that I chose. How do I represent things like corn or maize, cotton, rice, sorghum as actual numbers? Well, I could just use ordinal numbers. So corn is 1, cotton is 2, rice is 3. But this isn't really how machine learning works. So if I just directly input these, the model is going to do matrix multiplication. It's going to do addition, subtraction, all these other processes. Rice minus cotton is not equal to corn, right? Rice is not larger than or greater than cotton. So these numbers don't have any order, they don't have any magnitude, they don't have any meaning. These are categories. The numbers are really just there to represent them. So we cannot directly input these numbers as is. The model will be very confused and it will not work, and I have learned this from experience, trust me. What is the correct way to do this? We use something called a one-hot encoding. You actually already saw this on the last homework assignment, where we looked at the forest cover type, and there were different categories of soil type, and everyone was represented by a one-hot encoding. So a one-hot encoding is a vector with the length of the number of classes. 1 means true, 0 means false, and most of the time, unless you're dealing with multi-label input, only one of those values is allowed to be true at a time. You can also do this for text data, and this is exactly how we used to do text encoding. So if I have a sentence, this is a cat. Let's pretend for a second that these are the only 4 words in this entire language. If I want to convert this sentence to numerical format, I could create a vocabulary. In this case, it's in alphabetical order, but it doesn't have to be. So a cat is this, are my 4 possible words. The first word is this, so it's 0001, and that is my numerical version of that word. Now I've represented this word in a vector. Now you'll notice that this minus is not a word. It's 2 different numbers or negative numbers, so they don't have that same meaning anymore. There's no magnitude. They all have the same weight. They all have the same size. They're just vectors in different dimensions in this 4-dimensional space that I've created. So this is how we deal with categorical data. You're already using data that's been pre-processed. You might once in a while need to do this yourself, so it's important to know how to do it. The other thing that you've already seen before is cyclic encoding. So if we have information like time, for example, day of year or hour of day, this is actually a cycle. Day 1 and day 365, they're very similar, even though 1 and 365 are not nearby each other. Similarly, in space, if you have latitude or longitude, 0 degrees and 360 degrees, these are the same place on Earth. And we would like them to represent the same number. So what we did in homework 1 was we did a cyclic encoding. We can convert these with sine or cosine into a new representation. So now you'll see if I look at this top plot, 0 and I guess 2 pi probably, I can't read the numbers, 0 and 360 degrees, these are the same value. But there's a problem here. There's also certain inputs that have the same value, but they're not at the same time. So we actually need to use both sine and cosine to be able to deal with any differences there. So that's why we did that thing in homework 1, but it's fine to just say, because I told you to. But that's why. We need some way of representing time in a cycle. Normalization, you've also done this technically when you were doing some of your plotting, but this is the reason why. You'll also see this referred to as standardization, exact same thing. Some libraries will say, no, normalization means this and standardization means this. Other libraries will say the exact opposite. So I'm just saying they're approximately the same thing. When you're doing machine learning, most models, actually not linear regression, which is why I haven't taught you this yet, but most models assume that your data has certain characteristics. There's this independent and identically distributed assumption, which means that my sample is representative of the whole population, and typically a lot of these models assume that the inputs are approximately Gaussian distributed. So there might be extremes in one direction or another, but most of them are within a specific range. So how do we get our data into that format? You've also seen these image files that are uint12 or uint16, where there's very large values. We don't want any of our math to blow up during the machine learning process. So what we typically do is we normalize our data. There's several common ways that people do this. Probably the most common, especially historically, was the first one, where if I take my data and I subtract the mean and I divide the standard deviation, the result is that all of my numbers will be with 0 mean, centered at 0, and have approximately 1 standard deviation, positive and negative. And this is really useful because now my data kind of looks closer to a Gaussian. It's not all really large values. If I have multiple values, for example, wind speed and temperature, maybe wind speed is typically a very large number and temperature is typically a very small number. That does not mean that wind speed is more important. So I normalize these both to the range of -1 to 1, and then all of a sudden they can be influencing the model to the same extent. So that was probably more common traditionally. Nowadays, what I see people do more often is actually normalizing to 0 to 1 range. So you subtract by the minimum value, and then you divide by the range, max minus min, and then all of your numbers will be in the range of 0 to 1. This is basically what you did to plot a lot of your images in previous homework assignments. So this is more common. Another thing that you'll notice, like if you use QGIS, it's also doing this min-max normalization. It is not using exactly min or max. It is using something like the second percentile to the 98th percentile. So it's ignoring the extreme outliers, things like clouds, to avoid blowing up or squeezing the data too much. So you can also choose min-max to be slightly different than min-max. I really like to do 2% to 98% or 5% to 95% or something like that. Depends on how many outliers you expect in your data, but that helps a lot. The other thing that's common, not so common, this thing is the best option, but it's also the slowest option. You can do what's called histogram equalization, where I can say, for the image on the left, if you look at the color values, there's a lot of black values and a lot of bright white values, and not a lot in the middle. So we actually don't capture as much of the diversity in the image. Most of the numbers are kind of squished together in 2 clusters. If we want that thing to look closer to a Gaussian or closer to a normal distribution, we could do histogram equalization, where we force these numbers to be more equally balanced. And this actually works best. It's just really slow, so people don't often do it. Another thing that's important, when you're calculating min or max, or when you're calculating mean or standard deviation, usually you want to calculate the min and the max for the entire data set, not just for one image at a time. Because if you have a green image, you calculate min max, and you have a blue image and you calculate min max, and you normalize both of them separately, they're both the same image now. You've thrown away all of the unique features of this image by squishing them all in the same space. So typically we compute our mean, our standard deviation, our min, our max on the entire data set, but only on the training split, not on validation or test. We don't want to be influencing our accuracy because we know ahead of time what kind of images we'll see during testing. You also typically calculate mean, min, max, etc. for each band separately, because especially for some of these satellites, like for Landsat, the optical bands have a very different range than the thermal bands do. We want both of them to be approximately 0 to 1. We don't want to squish both of them to the full range. So calculate whatever your metric is on all the training data for each band one at a time. There are a few cases where you want to do one image normalized without knowing any of the other information, but those are relatively rare. Okay, sorry for taking so long. So this is the reading list for this lecture. These are really useful videos. They're only like 3 minutes. These are worth watching to explain more of the behind the scenes processing that is going on that you don't usually have to do. These are the tools that we're going to use for the homework assignment. So there's this GDAL command line interface that I've shown you a bunch of. If you have trouble installing GDAL, there's also the Raster.io and Fiona ones that do the same thing. GeoPandas doesn't have a command line interface, but it's really useful in Python for vector files. So you can use that as well. So that's the documentation for those. This last YouTube video here, I really find this interesting, but this might be really nerdy. Remember how I was complaining about how GDAL commands and OGR commands have like reversed inputs and inconsistent naming and things? After like 10 years, they finally sat down and said, let's make a new command line interface, one uniform, really well-designed thing that's easy and simple. This is like a 1-hour YouTube video of them talking about how they designed this and why they designed this. So if you want to learn more about the new command line interface, that's a really good video to learn from, but it is like an hour long. Homework 4 is about crop type mapping with Euro crops. I'll show you that in a second. Next week, we are going to be, I think that should be a 5. We will be doing cloud computing. In order to do cloud computing, you need cloud. These are 3 of the cloud computing sources that I am going to teach you. Google Colab, Google Earth Engine, and then Lightning Studio is kind of optional. So for the homework assignment next week, you do need to have a Google Earth Engine account to do it. So definitely make that one. For all of the homework assignments after that, we will be doing deep learning. And deep learning requires a GPU. And there are free GPUs in Google Colab and Lightning Studio. So that's why you make an account for those. So you don't need these for lecture, but you do need these for the rest of the homeworks after this. So make accounts for these. It takes a little while for some of them to get approved. And then let me quickly show you the homework and you can finally go home. Okay, so I alluded to this before. I have good news and bad news. The bad news is that this is the hardest homework assignment for the entire course. The good news is that all of the homework assignments after this are way easier. So if you survive this homework assignment, the rest of the course should be easy. So what are we doing? We're doing pre-processing with real data, raw data that has all of these differences, these unique features that we need to assimilate and make machine learning ready. You could do many of the things that I taught you in lecture today using GIS programs. I do not want you to use GIS because I want you to know what the GIS program uses to do those things, which is GDAL. Blah, blah, blah. For the command line tools, just like previous weeks, you can prefix it with an exclamation mark to run command line things from Jupyter you can also just put it in as a comment so I can see it. As long as I can see the code you ran, that's fine. Another really, really, really important thing is this. This is the hardest homework of the semester. People always struggle with this, and they always email me and say, I ran all these steps, but it doesn't work and I don't know why. And I will ask them which step is the problem, and they say, I don't know. After every single step of the process, you can visualize the output in GIS to see what it looks like. And if it doesn't look like what you think it is, or what you think it should look like, that's the problem. So visualization is extremely useful for debugging. If you have any problems, the first thing I'm going to ask you to do is, what does the data look like in QGIS? And if it looks right, that part's probably right. If it looks wrong, go back to that step. What are we doing? We are doing crop type mapping. This is really important for a lot of applications, everything from food security to famine to commodity trading. This is one of the many things that I've done a little bit of research on at one point or another. So basically the goal is for every pixel in an image, in a satellite image, label that pixel with the agriculture that is found there. So here are the things you're allowed to use. There's actually quite a lot here. I'm trying to be pretty flexible. So you can use GDAL, raster.io, Fiona on the command line. You can also use them in Python. So we have Fiona. GeoPandas is useful, especially for the extra credit. NumPy you'll use at one point or another. I don't think Pandas is useful, but it might be. You can use raster.io, of course, and then all of the things that we've seen before for plotting, for machine learning. So some of this, especially this part, you mostly just copy and paste this from the previous homework assignment. We've done this before. Step 1, download Eurocrops. We've already done that. That's easy. Don't worry about that. It is the zip file that you want, not the CSV file. So get the right file, but you can just download these from Zenodo. There's no magic function to download it. Just click a button. Downloading Sentinel-2. I've already shown you how to do this too. Now we need to redo it. You need a Sentinel image that has the same location as your Eurocrops data for whatever country that you pick. And it also has to be from the same year, preferably during the summer, otherwise you're not going to see the agriculture. It should be relatively cloud-free, etc. So again, if you load both your image and your vector files in QGIS, they should overlap. If they don't, you've already messed up. So that will save you some time. So get a Sentinel image from the same location as your QGIS image. Here's the preprocessing. This is where the preprocessing starts. So these are all the bands. You'll notice that different bands have different resolution. I want you to combine all of these into one file with 10-meter resolution. So resample all the bands to 10-meter resolution, merge them all to one multi-band file using GDAL merge-separate or rheostack, and then crop it to 1024 by 1024 pixels anywhere in the image where you see farmland and you have labels, of course. Again, visualize after each one of these steps. If you see that you've cropped it down and it looks like the right colors, great. If not, you did something wrong here. You can do this with like 3 lines of GDAL. So resample each file, merge each file, and then crop each file. You can actually combine these and do these in one command, and it'll be faster because you're not resampling the entire file. You're only resampling the small 1024 by 1024. Or you can do this in like 20 or 30 lines of Python. That's also fine. But I really do recommend learning the command line interface. It is extremely useful, powerful, and fast. Yeah, so that's the preprocessing for the image. Make everything the same resolution, merge, and crop. For the Eurocrops data, this is a shape file. It's also in a different coordinate reference system. So first, reproject it from its current coordinate system to the same coordinate system as Sentinel-2. Then convert it from a vector file into a raster file. This is the rasterization process. So GDAL rasterize from shapefile to geotiff. You can use the field crop class as the burn-in value. Again, that can either be that Eurocrops code thing, that long number, or that short number if your country has a short number, but both are fine. And then crop it to the same geospatial extent as your Sentinel-2 image. It helps to actually do the last two steps at the same time. Otherwise, you have to do like target aligned pixels. Otherwise, your two images are slightly off by half a pixel. So again, double check that and visualize that. And just these two steps are almost always where students have problems. This is hard. I've tried to make this assignment easier every semester, but I eventually stopped because this is the reality of real data. You should experience how difficult it is to pre-process this data so that you know all the hard work that goes into it and how to do things if there is no existing data sets. So this is basically how to create your own data set. Okay, everything else, you can do some of these in GDAL, but the rest of these I just do in Python because it's a little easier. So in coding, we need to convert our labels for every field to ordinal numbers. So even if this field, even if corn is value 1024, we want to map it to the value 0, and cotton to the value 1, and sorghum to the value 2, etc. So for whatever data you have, for your little window that you care about, figure out the 10 most common classes, or the 9 most common classes, and then everything else is a 10th other class, and then convert all of those values to the range 0 to 9. So now we have 0 is the most common class, 1 is the second most common class, etc. This is also kind of hard. So this is another part where people struggle a lot. Splitting, we're going to do a geographic train val test split. So we want to see how well the model performs on areas it's never seen before. Use the west half for training, northeast corner for validation, southeast corner for testing. This is the easiest part. I have seen students pull out the weirdest solutions for this and make it way more complicated than it needs to be. You're just taking an array and chopping it down to a smaller size. So that's not that hard. It's not as hard as you think it is. Train a machine learning model of your choice. Don't care. Report accuracy, etc. These are worth 5 points because you've done this before. You can just copy and paste this. So this is actually the easy part. The machine learning is easy. The hard part is the pre-processing. Finally, plotting. So I want you to plot the test image. Now, when you're making your visualization, you're only using the red, green, blue bands, but all of the previous steps, you're using all of that information, not just red, green, blue. So take the red, green, blue bands and make a plot of a true color image and the ground truth mask and the predicted mask. And you should be able to see that you do okay, but it's really noisy, it's really ugly. The results are not supposed to be great, but they should look like it's learning something. It's not like the input is mostly blue and the output is mostly green or something like that. They should be getting it right most of the time, especially on the common classes. So that's the main assignment. This is really hard and really time consuming. I really do recommend starting as soon as you can. This will take you more time than all the other assignments, but it also teaches you more than all the other assignments, so I don't want to make it too easy. So I try to spell out all the steps that you need to do for each thing. If by some miracle you finish early and you have extra time, the extra credit is relatively easy and really useful for something that you might actually do on a final project. So we have a lot of noise in our predictions, but we also know the bounds of each field. So we can do majority voting for each field and say, this is mostly corn. Let's just say the whole field is corn and get rid of all the noise very quickly and easily. So load your shapefile using something like Fiona or GeoPandas. For each field, you can imagine a for loop here, but it doesn't have to be. For each field, get all the predictions from the raster image, use majority voting, and then now that is a new attribute of this field. Then recalculate these accuracy metrics at the field level. They might be better, they might be worse. That doesn't mean that the result is worse. So these are not really comparable to the pixel level predictions because we're not weighting them by field area. And then finally, using GIS, QGIS, ArcGIS, whatever, plot your image and these field level predictions on the same map and add English labels for the 10 classes. So that's kind of something like this, or kind of something like this, but with the actual predictions, not with the real data. Any questions on this homework? I apologize that this is very hard, but that's also the reality, unfortunately, of pre-processing. It really is most of the work. The machine learning on this assignment is easy. The pre-processing is really important to get right. Go slowly, go carefully, visualize after every step to make sure it's working the way you think it should work. And please ask me if you have problems, because I'm happy to help. Last semester, a lot of people never finished this one, but they also didn't ask for help, so I can't help them. So I'm happy to help debug things before or after lecture. Again, we have office hours on Tuesday, and I've been pretty good at email so far, so let's keep that up. All right, I think that's everything. I will finally let you go home.